Ashes in the parlor. The grand parlor of Count Reinhardt's Vienna residence glittered with opulence. Gilded frames hung heavy with portraits of stern ancestors. Chandeliers dripped crystals, catching the flickering candlelight, and the air was thick with the scent of fine perfume and roasted meats. The aristocrats had gathered for a celebratory evening, marking the political upheavals of 1848 with the kind of pomp only old money could muster. Guests arrived in lavish gowns and meticulously tailored coats, their laughter echoing against the high ceilings, mixing with the soft strains of a string quartet playing in the corner. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal, a tableau of wealth and privilege that concealed the unease lingering beneath the polished veneer. Josephine, the Count's niece, wandered near the grand marble fireplace, her eyes tracing the curling smoke rising from the logs. She had always felt a strange energy in this room, a subtle hum that seemed to resonate beneath the ornate tapestries and the polished parquet floor. Tonight, however, the sensation was stronger, almost tangible, prickling her skin as though invisible fingers brushed against her shoulders. The conversation around her blurred and ecstatic, and her attention focused on the flickering shadows dancing across the mantelpiece. There was a rhythm to the flames, a heartbeat she could almost hear, in sync with the low, resonant tolling of distant church bells outside. As the evening progressed, small disturbances began to draw the attention of more perceptive guests. The fire in the grand hearth shifted unnaturally, logs cracking and spitting embers in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost choreographed. A fine layer of ash began to drift upward, not from the logs, but forming as if it were conjured from the air itself. At first, it seemed playful, a trick of the light and smoke, but then shapes began to emerge, silhouettes that resembled the deceased members of the Reinhardt family, their outlines rendered in ghostly white, suspended above the mantel, their expressions frozen in grim judgment. Guests laughed nervously, attributing the phenomenon to a draft, to superstition, or to the champagne loosening their senses. Yet Josephine felt her stomach tighten with dread. The air grew colder, and whispers began to slip through the room, soft and indistinct at first, barely audible over polite chatter. Words took shape, but they were not spoken aloud. "Remember, ashes come forth." Her pulse quickened as she realized these were not the imaginings of a drunken mind. A distant knock sounded, echoing from a door no one had used, followed by a second, then a third. The candles flickered violently as the shadows on the walls elongated unnaturally, twisting into grotesque shapes that mocked the guests' movements. Josephine clutched her fan tightly, knuckles white, sensing that something old, powerful, and resentful had been awakened in the room, something that regarded this gathering not with curiosity, but with judgment. Count Reinhardt himself appeared at the head of the parlor, raising a hand to calm his guests, but his eyes betrayed unease. The portraits lining the walls seemed to shift imperceptibly, ancestors' faces warping ever so slightly, their painted eyes glinting with a malevolent awareness. The room's opulence now felt like a mask, fragile and thin, over something ancient and dark that pulsed beneath the parquet. Josephine's gaze returned to the fireplace, where the ash continued to form the shapes of the dead, and she noticed the first tendril of black smoke curling into the room, moving with intent. The murmuring of the assembled aristocrats grew uneasy, a subtle tension threading through the air, and she realized that the evening was no longer about celebration. Something had been disturbed, and it was only a matter of time before the parlor itself decided to reveal its intentions. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, though still tempered with polite laughter, an attempt to disguise unease. Candles flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls, shadows that refused to correspond with the guests' movements. Josephine's eyes remained fixed on the fireplace. The ash had thickened, forming shapes that seemed more defined than before. At first, she thought she saw only familiar faces of the Reinhardt ancestors, but as the minutes passed, she realized that the figures depicted scenes she could not recognize. Skeletal hands clutching delicate objects, hollow eyes peering through empty sockets, and mouths frozen in silent screams. A subtle smell of burnt flesh began to permeate the room, faint yet unmistakable, mingling with the scent of perfumed hair and polished wood. "Is it the smoke?" whispered a young baron near Josephine, his voice tight with fear. No one answered. Their eyes were drawn to the parlor's fireplace as if held in a spell. The fire leapt higher, though no additional logs had been added, and the ash swirled in precise, deliberate patterns. Some guests clutched their fans, others shifted nervously, but none dared approach. From the corner of the room, a servant dropped a tray with crystal glasses, the sound shattering the tense silence. Yet even this small noise did not distract the shadows. Josephine noticed that each ghostly outline appeared to repeat the movements of the guests as they laughed, sipped wine, or conversed. It was as if the past and present were intermingling, the dead mocking or observing the living with a patience that no human could sustain. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the parlor, extinguishing several candles simultaneously. Darkness pooled in the corners, leaving only the fireplace as a glowing epicenter, surrounded by ghostly forms. The taller portraits, previously inert, seemed to tilt slightly forward, their painted eyes glinting unnaturally. Whispers began again, low and almost imperceptible at first, then growing louder, forming words that threaded through the minds of the gathered guests. "Leave before it consumes. Remember the ashes." The room felt alive, watching, predatory. A chair scraped across the parquet, moving on its own, tipping slightly before righting itself, as though obeying an invisible force. Guests murmured nervously, a few stepping back toward the doors, but the parlor seemed to stretch, expanding subtly, ensuring they remained contained. Josephine's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel a pull from the fireplace, an energy that demanded attention. The ash twisted and rose, forming miniature scenes of death and decay, tiny tableaus that seemed impossibly real. She could see a child, perhaps the Count's nephew, long lost to illness, reaching upward, mouth open in a silent scream, only to be pulled back into the swirling haze. Other figures appeared, servants who had vanished in the last decade, soldiers, women in gowns stained dark, all bound within the ash, their features horrifyingly precise. Each tableau replayed a fragment of a forgotten past, yet with subtle differences, alterations that suggested the parlor itself was rewriting history, blending truth and nightmare into one. Count Reinhardt finally raised his hand to speak, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to maintain authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The whispers intensified, threading into his mind, hinting at events no mortal should witness, deaths, betrayals, and secrets buried long ago by ancestors whose eyes now watched from canvas and ash alike. The chandeliers shook slightly, crystals rattling, and a faint, almost musical hum emanated from the floorboards themselves. Josephine felt her knees weaken. She had never known fear like this, a blend of awe and terror that wrapped around her mind. She realized that the parlor had claimed its first step into her consciousness, testing her resolve, seeing how the living might withstand the presence of the dead fully returned. A sudden crack split the air as a log in the fireplace exploded into a plume of blackened sparks. The ash swirled violently, taking on the shapes of the guests themselves, mocking their movements, their gestures, their laughter. Eyes that were not human stared at them from the shifting smoke. The whispered words were clear now. Remember the ashes. You cannot leave. The parlor will not forgive. Josephine's fingers clutched her fan so tightly it splintered, and she realized that this was no ordinary haunting. The parlor had awakened fully, sentient, and it demanded acknowledgement, reverence, and fear. Each aristocrat's polite veneer was melting under the pressure, their polite laughter turning to startled gasps as the room itself became a living, malevolent entity. The parlor seemed to pulse with life, the once familiar room warping subtly around the edges of vision. The chandeliers swayed without breeze, and shadows leapt independently, crawling up the walls as if trying to escape the corners of the room. Guests began to stumble, some clutching their chests, as if an invisible weight pressed down upon them. The whispers grew sharper, not merely suggestions now, but demands, echoing directly in the minds of those present. Obey, witness, fear, join us. A faint, metallic taste filled the air, and the scent of charwood mingled with something far fouler, a pungent aroma of decay that made stomachs heave. Josephine pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to mask a gasp, but it seemed the parlor could hear her, for the flames in the hearth responded with a sudden, sharp flare, sending embers shooting into the air. The ash spiraled higher now, coalescing into larger, more recognizable forms. Guests recoiled as they saw not only their ancestors but distorted versions of themselves, figures with hollow eyes, elongated limbs, and expressions twisted in silent terror. One elderly count stumbled backward, clutching his cane as a shadow reached toward him, slipping across the floor like liquid smoke. He tried to speak, to call for assistance, but his voice caught in his throat. Others tried to move, but the door seemed farther than they had been moments before, the room stretching, subtly yet unmistakably, trapping them within its malevolent bounds. Josephine's eyes were drawn to the mantelpiece. The figures in the ash now reenacted moments of death, betrayal, and despair, each scene more vivid, more grotesque than the last, and with each movement, the air grew colder, almost biting, chilling bones and nerves alike. The Count himself approached the fireplace, trembling but determined. His fingers hovered over the hearth's edge as if to assert dominance over the room, but a sudden, unnatural gust of wind pushed him back. The ash leapt, forming a dense column that rose higher than any man should have thought possible, twisting into a swirling mass of phantom limbs and faces. One of the faces, unmistakably a younger version of the Count, reached forward as if to claw at him. He recoiled, shouting, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive resonance of the room. Mirrors reflected not the current gathering, but twisted tableaus of the same guests in moments of horror and agony. And in those reflections, eyes followed each observer, accusing and unrelenting. Josephine could feel her own heartbeat loud in her ears, a frantic drum against the overwhelming chorus of whispers. She tried to take her niece's hand, but the girl's fingers passed through hers as if she were insubstantial. Panic rose in her chest, and she realized with dawning terror that the parlor could manipulate not only perception but substance itself. Chairs, once solid, seemed to ripple and bend, forming grotesque shapes before snapping back, as if testing the limits of reality. The servants, previously obedient, now appeared ghost-like, their forms elongated and indistinct, faces frozen in masks of anguish, moving in ways that defied natural motion. The string quartet's music warped into discordant notes, some instruments emitting sounds beyond human capacity, scraping at the minds of all present. From the corner of the room, a servant, though now appearing semi-transparent, pointed a trembling finger toward the hearth. Josephine followed the gesture and saw a new figure rising from the swirling ash. A woman in tattered finery, her face hidden by a veil, hands outstretched, beckoning, commanding. The whispers intensified, now forming coherent phrases. Bow, confess, remember, suffer. Guests screamed, stumbling back, some tripping over rugs or furniture that had subtly shifted, as though the room itself conspired against them. The Count cried out for reason, for order, but even his authority seemed to fade beneath the parlor's will. Josephine felt the temperature plummet further, frost forming on the edges of the windows and mirrors, a physical manifestation of the room's hostility. Amid the chaos, Josephine realized that fear alone seemed to empower the parlor. Every gasp, every panicked movement, every whispered prayer gave the ash and shadows greater form and coherence. She forced herself to breathe steadily, anchoring her mind, and noticed that the hollow figures occasionally flickered, revealing faint glimpses of the room as it had been before the disturbance. The presence of the living, fully conscious and determined, could resist, or perhaps delay, the parlor's hunger. She clenched her hands into fists, resolved to find a way to confront whatever force had awakened within the hearth before it claimed more than their sanity. The larger shadow in the ash raised its form higher, a towering silhouette of a man, then a woman, then shifting into grotesque hybrid shapes, faces and limbs twisting unnaturally. The air vibrated with an oppressive energy that seemed to thrum directly in Josephine's bones. The parlor, she understood, was no longer a room. It was a sentient entity, ancient and resentful, and tonight it would test every guest to their breaking point. And yet, somewhere deep in her chest, a stubborn spark of courage remained, the first real defiance against the room's malevolent intelligence. The parlor had transformed beyond recognition. The walls quivered as if alive, gold moldings twisting into grotesque shapes, stretching and bending with a will of their own. Guests shrieked, some clinging to each other, others fleeing toward doors that now seemed impossibly distant. The chandeliers swung violently, crystals crashing to the parquet, scattering shards that reflected 1,000 flickering faces in the blackened ash. Josephine's pulse hammered in her ears as the temperature plunged further, and a biting wind snaked through the room, carrying with it voices that spoke in accents long forgotten, demanding obeisance, acknowledgement, fear. Every footstep was swallowed by the parlor itself. Each attempted motion seemed to slow, impeded by invisible hands that reached from corners and shadows. The towering figure that had emerged from the ash became more defined, its body a patchwork of distorted human forms, limbs jutting at unnatural angles, faces melding into one another, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The whispers coalesced into commands, echoing inside the minds of the guests. Confess, kneel, join us. Those who faltered or panicked were seized by the room's will, pulled toward the hearth, which now glowed with a sinister, otherworldly fire. Josephine watched in horror as one young baron, frozen in place by invisible force, was lifted from the floor, his body arcing toward the flickering flames. When he hit the edge of the hearth, the ash leapt like a tidal wave, engulfing him in a swirl of spectral forms. He did not scream. His voice had been swallowed entirely, but the shadow of his presence lingered briefly, distorted and twisted, before dissolving into smoke. Count Reinhardt, pale and trembling, shouted for calm, waving his arms, but even he could not command the room. Mirrors reflected the parlor in impossible ways, hallways that did not exist, doors to unknown chambers, and the faces of the guests contorted in agony, some doubling in size, some shrinking, others replaced entirely by the staring visages of long-dead ancestors. Josephine could feel her mind teetering on the edge of sanity, the room's sentience probing her fears, dissecting her thoughts, amplifying every doubt and terror. A candle blew out near her, and in the darkness, she thought she saw a shadow detach itself from the floor, moving toward the Count with deliberate intent. The hearth flared again, sending sparks shooting upward, forming miniature figures that replayed moments of death, betrayal, and suffering. One figure, unmistakably a servant long deceased, pointed toward the parlor's center, as if selecting victims. Those who met its gaze felt their limbs grow heavy, their breath short, their voices caught in throats that refused to obey. Josephine forced herself to breathe, to think, anchoring her awareness in the reality of her own presence, refusing to let the parlor dictate her fear. She grabbed the Count's sleeve, and together they tried to move as a group, urging the other guests to do the same. The shadows surged, tendrils of ash and smoke lashing at anyone who attempted to flee, wrapping around their ankles, tugging them backward toward the hearth. A chilling, metallic laugh echoed from the fireplace, resonant and unnatural, as if multiple voices had fused into one. The tallest shadow, the amalgamation of twisted ancestors and victims, leaned toward the living, and the room vibrated with its silent, oppressive power. Josephine's heart thumped furiously. She realized that the parlor fed on fear, shaping its manifestations according to the terror it could extract. She focused on the faces of those nearest her, the ones she could protect. With deliberate calm, she spoke softly, guiding them, grounding them, refusing to let their panic become fuel. For the first time, a small flicker of defiance appeared among the living, a spark that made some shadows waver, some ash forms shudder and hesitate. Yet the parlor was relentless. The mirrors cracked with jagged lines, the walls stretched, and a sudden, deafening roar of voices filled the room, chanting in unison. Ashes remember, obey, remain. Josephine realized there would be no mercy, no negotiation. The only hope lay in confronting the hearth, in daring to face the ancient force that had risen from the very foundation of the house. The Count, though shaking violently, nodded at her, and together they advanced toward the fireplace, every step an act of courage against the sentient will of the room. Josephine and Count Reinhardt stepped closer to the hearth, feeling the heat not as warmth but as a pressuring force, an almost sentient power radiating from the roaring flames. The amalgam of shadows swirled higher, faces and limbs writhing, reaching, clawing at the air, seeking submission. The guests, paralyzed by fear, yet partially anchored by Josephine's calm voice, watched in terror as the room itself seemed to take a breath, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that mimicked a living creature. Candles flickered violently, chandeliers swung like pendulums, and the mirrors reflected not the present, but twisted memories of every past gathering, every death, every betrayal, all converging in a chaotic symphony of despair. Josephine felt an instinctive pull. The parlor demanded a sacrifice, a recognition of its dominance, but she forced herself to stand tall, to face the force head-on. Reaching out, she laid a hand on the hearth's edge. The shadows recoiled slightly, the swirling ash condensing into a dense mass, forming the visage of a woman in tattered finery, her eyes hollow but observing. The whispers, once fractured, became clear. Bow, confess, remember. Josephine shook her head, steadying her breath, and spoke aloud. We will remember, but we will not obey your terror. You have your memories, but not our fear. The room trembled violently, as if enraged by her defiance. A flash of black smoke shot upward, and for a moment, Josephine feared it would engulf her entirely. Then, slowly, the shadows began to falter, the ash descending back toward the hearth, the swirling forms losing coherence. The mirrors, once fractured with grotesque visions, regained clarity, reflecting only the current room. A faint warmth returned, though the oppressive chill lingered. The guests, dazed and pale, stumbled back, some clutching each other, others staring in disbelief. Count Reinhardt turned to Josephine, his face a mixture of awe and relief. The parlor, it has relented, he whispered. But Josephine's eyes remained fixed on the hearth, wary of its apparent calm. She had seen enough to know that such a sentient presence did not simply vanish. It waited, biding its time. As the guests slowly regained composure, a tentative silence fell over the parlor. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by occasional glances at the fireplace. The music from the string quartet resumed, though shakily, each note trembling as though uncertain of the space it occupied. Josephine walked among the guests, reassuring them, grounding them, but she could not shake the feeling that every step echoed in the awareness of the room. The ash in the hearth now formed subtle patterns, like marks left intentionally, warnings or signs she could not yet interpret. Each flicker of candlelight seemed to reveal eyes observing her from corners she knew to be empty. Hours later, as the last guest departed, Josephine lingered near the fireplace. The parlor had quieted, but the oppressive aura remained, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. She reached into the embers, and for a moment, a tendril of black ash rose and lingered in her palm, not threatening but watchful, a reminder that the room remembered everything, including her defiance. Count Reinhardt watched silently from behind her, a shiver running down his spine. Outside, Vienna slept unaware of the horrors contained within the grand parlor. But Josephine understood that the house's true nature would endure, patient, sentient, and hungry. Tonight, they had survived, but the parlor had left its mark, a reminder that some forces are neither seen nor understood, only endured. As she finally turned to leave, Josephine glanced back once more. The hearth's glow seemed to pulse, faint whispers rising again, just audible, teasing the edges of consciousness. We will wait. We will remember. We will return. She swallowed hard, knowing that the night's events were not a conclusion, but a beginning. The parlor's legacy, carved in ash and shadow, would linger, an eternal sentinel, watching, shaping, and reminding all who enter that the dead and the living share the same space, if only the living dare to acknowledge it. The parlor remained, timeless and sentient, its hunger unquenched, awaiting the next gathering, the next challenge, the next spark of fear to feed upon.